This is Grape Video 39, Vineyard Site Selection, Part 1, The Global View. In this video, we're going to talk about why vineyards are where they are throughout the world and give some general characteristics of vineyard regions. From there, we're going to progress to more detailed information on specific site selection. But let's start out to say, when you're looking at a vineyard like this on a beautiful hillside, there's something that this vineyard has in common with all the vineyards of the world. And we're going to take a global look at that connection among all the vineyards of the world. We're going to start this story with a review of a concept that is called growing degree days. Grapevines become physiologically active at temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. Therefore, a summation of temperatures during the growing season above those temperatures is often used to express the heat that influences grapevine function. This heat accumulation is expressed in units called growing degree days. In its simplest form, the calculation of the growing degree day for a specific day is done by averaging the high and low temperatures of the day, and then the base temperature of 50 degrees or 10 degrees Celsius is subtracted from that average. That sounds a bit complicated, so let's give some explanation with an example. For example, if the high temperature for a day were 82 degrees or 28 degrees Celsius and the low temperature were 56 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius, then the growing degree days for that day would be calculated as follows. In Fahrenheit, it would be 82 plus 56 divided by 2 minus the 50 degree base temperature, or an accumulation for that day of 19 growing degree day units. Similarly, if we calculate it in Celsius, the numbers look like this, and we have about 10.5 growing degree day units accumulated when the temperatures are as indicated above. The worldwide standard for comparing one viticultural region to another is the sum of the growing degree days for a 7-month period. In the Northern Hemisphere, that is done from April 1 to October 31. So that's our brief review of growing degree days, and we're going to come back and use that information in a little while here. But let's go on and talk about the vineyards of the world, whether it be in Michigan or in this beautiful vineyard setting in northern Italy in the Trentino region. Macroclimate, that's the viticultural term to describe the general climate of a viticultural region. We're going to look at a global picture of the macroclimate characteristics of vineyards around the world in this presentation. The principal viticultural regions of the world are predominantly found in temperate climates. Simple statement, because grapes are a temperate climate crop, generally speaking. So if we look at the world like this, and by the way, there are much more complete and elegant presentations on these topics to be found on the internet. We're just trying here to give an overview of vineyards of the world before we get more specialized with looking at specific vineyard sites. But here is the world, and if we look at it like this, here we have the two bands of latitude from 30 to 50 degrees, and we find that the major grape growing regions of the world are found in that range of latitudes. On the west coast of the United States, on the east coast, and then numerous places throughout Europe and the Mediterranean area. The largest concentrations of grapes in the world throughout this area. Moving on, we go down to South America, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and of course, Michigan. So it shouldn't be a surprise to those growing grapes that grapes are a temperate climate crop, and they're almost always going to be found in those latitudes between 30 and 50 degrees. Now, the principal regions of the world are predominantly found in the temperate climates, and they are often influenced by large bodies of water. Here is a map showing the Great Lakes region that I'm from, and the red star is St. Joseph, Michigan, where I live. And these are very large bodies of fresh water. The Lake Michigan itself is the 6th largest freshwater body in the world. And we really love that lake, and we really benefit from it in our production of grapes. Here is a picture of our shoreline on a summer's evening looking across Lake Michigan. It's between 50 and 60 miles across the lake to get to the other side, the state of Wisconsin. So that huge body of water has such a large moderating influence on our climate, and we just love living by it. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to travel in Italy, and so when I was preparing to go there, I was curious how the area I lived in, St. Joseph, Michigan, compared with Italy. And so I superimposed Lake Michigan here in blue on top of a map of Italy. What I found, to my amazement, was that St. Joseph, Michigan is almost at the same latitude as Rome, right there. We're about 13 miles north of Rome, or 22 kilometers, but that's almost identical latitude between Rome and St. Joseph, Michigan. So I thought, let's make a comparison of the weather, of the climate of those two locations. Well, before we do the numbers, here's a larger map showing all of the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean Sea is composed of many different seas, and surrounding Italy on one side the Adriatic Sea and the Tyrrhenian Sea, and so on and so on. And this is why we often call the climate in this area a Mediterranean climate, because it is so very, very highly influenced by large bodies of water. Italy itself is a peninsula, of course, and it's surrounded by water. So let's see how that influences the climate of Rome. Here we are, almost identical latitudes, Rome, Italy, St. Joseph, Michigan, and the growing degree days that we reviewed show such a much larger accumulation of heat in Rome because of that Mediterranean climate moderating the temperatures year-round than St. Joseph, Michigan. Well, I had to ask myself, what if we were to take a place at that same latitude as St. Joseph and Rome that was not influenced by a body of water? I found such a place in Idaho. So I I added Idaho to my listing and compared it to St. Joseph back in Michigan next to Lake Michigan. So here are the data. And look how similar the growing degree day accumulations are for St. Joseph and Preston. Preston, without any large body of water near it, is what is called a continental climate. And it behaves quite differently, but not in terms of growing degree day accumulation from April 1 to October 31st, but that's not the whole story. Let's look a little deeper. Let's look at the growing season length in days for these three locations. I was amazed to find that it never freezes in Rome. I had no idea that they have no days in which the temperature goes below freezing. So, in concept at least, they have a 365-day growing season length. Wow. Talk about the Mediterranean climate and its influence. That's amazing. Same latitude as St. Joseph. Well, we're not so fortunate. Our last freeze in the spring occurs around May 1st on average, and our first freeze in the fall is around October 22nd to give us about 175-day growing season length. And so in reality, if we look at the growing season, growing degree days, we can't just use April 1 to October 31 because of these freeze events. We have a shortened growing season, and that in effect changes the growing degree days for our growing season more like 2,564. It's diminished by that much. Let's go on to look at what happens to the growing season length of a continental climate like Preston, Idaho. Ouch. Only 111 days in their growing season because their last spring freeze in the spring on average May 21, and their first one is, ouch, September 9th. So there's no value in calculating the growing degree days from April 1 to October 31 when these freeze events shorten the growing season effectively to 111 days, and that reduces the growing degree day accumulation for their growing season all the way down to a little over 2,000 growing degree days. And there you have, for three places of the very same latitude and radically different growing degree day accumulations for the growing season. Why? Because of the influence of large bodies of water or not. So let's go back to our statement that says the principal viticultural regions of the world are predominantly found in temperate climates, and they are often influenced by large bodies of water. And then we'll add this statement, and or elevation. We'll take a little side trip here. Let's look at this elevation effect. The influence of elevation is this. Air cools with increasing elevation at a rate that can vary from about 3 degrees to 5 degrees or so per 1,000 feet of elevation, depending upon the humidity of the air. That means that as we go up in elevation, we get a cooler climate at the very same latitude. Lapse rate makes it possible to have suitable vineyard sites at the lower latitudes when elevation lowers the overall air temperature. And we're going to leave it at that, but we just thought we'd add that in to complete the story, why there are exceptions to that latitude range that we mentioned earlier. Here is a chart showing 10 viticultural regions around the world, along with their latitudes and their seasonal degree day accumulations on a base 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And the light green areas that we have highlighted here are those in a mid-range of growing degree day accumulation, so that we go from a low of about 2,464 in Bordeaux to a high of about 3,300 in St. Helena, California, the Napa Valley, if you will. And you can see that this then typifies the type of climate that has become well known for quality wine production, be it Napa Valley, St. Helena, be it Canberra, Australia, Bordeaux. And in there highlighted is my hometown, St. Joe, Michigan, with that 2636. So it's right in there in the running to produce quality grapes and quality wine with that about 2,500 to 3,300 growing degree day accumulation. We have 3 viticultural regions now highlighted, and their growing degree day accumulation starts off at a high, say, of Marlborough in New Zealand down to the Champagne region in Reims, France at 1756. And if you think of it, those areas are known for grapes that grow in a cool climate. They are early ripening grapes, and or they are grapes that do not fully ripen because they're processed into champagne. So that range of growing degree days, say from about 1,800 to 2,300, is on the low end of established, well-known viticultural regions. At the extreme, we have the Fresno, California, or the Central Valley, if you will, of California, represented by Fresno, California. And the degree day accumulation there is 4,684. Generally speaking, the Central Valley of California is an area that produces large crops of grapes, high sugars, low acids, because this heat tends to metabolize away much of the acidity in the grape while building high sugars. And so the grapes and the wine from an area like this are considered okay, but not exceptional. So we have bracketed the mid-range of growing degree days with 3 areas that have relatively low growing degree days, and this one higher, much higher than average. So it kind of tells you that ideally, to produce a typical grape and a typical high quality wine, growing degree days accumulation of around 2,500 to 3,300 growing degree days is really where you want to be. So if you're in a viticultural region, ask yourself, what is that growing degree day accumulation? Is it something like this, higher or lower? When we talk about a viticultural region, we really need to talk about it within the framework of the varieties being grown there. And I'm going to illustrate that by showing you these hybrid varieties that we grow in southwest Michigan. And we also grow several of the Vitis vinifera varieties, and these 6 are our principal varieties that we grow there. So when we're considering grape production in southwest Michigan, we think of it in terms of the varieties that we are growing. And if we do that, we look at what happens not during the growing season and the growing degree days, but what happens in that other part of the year when the vines are dormant. What happens in the wintertime with the minimum temperatures that affect our grapevines for the kinds of varieties that we grow. So we would say that the winter minimum temperature benchmarks for Michigan, and southwest Michigan in particular, are these. When we incur temperatures as lows for the winter of, say, 5 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit or minus 15 Celsius, that's no problem for the varieties we grow. We come through the winter, as we just did this past winter, with little or no injury to our vines, and we can expect to have a nice crop the following growing season. Skipping down, as soon as the temperatures for the winter minimums go negative, here minus 5 Fahrenheit or minus 21 Celsius, we know that we will start to have injury on at least some of our vines on the more tender varieties that we grow. And those would include Merlot and Sauvignon Blanc specifically. Varieties that are that cold tender are going to start to have problems at these temperatures. You go down to the bottom of this chart. When we get to minus 15 Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to minus 26 Celsius, oh my gosh, we have severe injury on most of our varieties. Very few will not be hurt by these low temperatures. And we just had, in the previous 2 winters before this past one, temperatures down in that minus 15. Both years had severe winter injury in many of our vineyards. It was devastating. But once again, these are guidelines for our area for the kinds of grapes that we grow. You have to ask yourself, for where you're growing grapes, what are the guidelines that would influence the winter injury for your varieties? For example, this is the Marquette variety. It was created at the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota reports for the variety Marquette. Marquette has proven to be an outstanding vine. In terms of cold hardiness, it has withstood temperatures as low as minus 36 Fahrenheit, that's minus 38 Celsius, without serious injury. Wow. Well, they do have a lot of very cold weather in Minnesota and also other places out there where grapes are grown, be it Iowa, Nebraska, the Dakotas. And so when they're looking at what makes for a suitable viticultural region or vineyard site, they're looking at it more in terms of varieties that have the hardiness levels of Marquette. And so they have a different measure of hardiness than we do here in Michigan. And you will need to ask yourself, for where you're going to grow grapes, what is that unit of measure that tells me whether I have varieties that will withstand these temperatures in the winter or not. This is not a suitable measuring stick for Minnesota and other areas that have very, very cold temperatures and therefore grow very, very hardy varieties. Here's a picture I took years ago of many, many varieties. So look up in the literature the varieties you're most likely to grow and learn their hardiness characteristics to see how they fit into your viticultural region and what temperatures you can endure in your vineyard site within that viticultural region. So let me describe to you the characteristics of the Southwest Michigan Viticultural Region where I live. As we know it, we call it the Lake Michigan Shore Appellation. Number one, it has a growing season of about 175 days. It has an average of 2,636 growing degree days from April 1 to October 31. It has a winter minimum temperature of minus 15 Fahrenheit or lower, and it occurs in 1 out of 10 years, and a winter minimum temperature of minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit or lower in 3 out of 10 years. And fourth, the precipitation averages 36 inches per year. These are the characteristics of the viticultural region where I live. Ask yourself, where I'm going to plant grapes, what are the characteristics of that viticultural region, and seek the data, the information to answer that question. A viticultural region often matures to become dominated by a relatively few wine grape varieties. This occurs because the climate of that region is ideally suited to ripen those grape varieties for their intended purpose. In the case of the Champagne region, it may be to make champagne. And because the winter minimum temperatures allow for the long-term survival and productivity of those varieties. In our next video, we're going to talk about mesoclimate. Mesoclimate, the climate of a specific property. That is the property you already own or the property you are considering to purchase suitable for a vineyard? We'll address the topic of mesoclimate, and this will help to answer for you that question. Is the property you have or the property you're thinking of buying suitable for a vineyard? Here's the property that I have, and we know that this valley bottom in the foreground is not suitable for grape production, but that hillside in the background most certainly is. That's where we produce these Cabernet Sauvignon, and we have them on a south-facing slope so that they get wonderful sunshine, and they mature as we're almost ready to pick these. You can see the senescing or yellowing of the leaves as we near the end of the growth period. And here they are, the Merlot that we grow a little higher on the slope earlier in the season, well exposed with leaf removal, waiting for harvest. And here's harvest, the time that we've worked for all year long. And we pick the grapes, and we know that we can grow grapes well right here, but just over the top of the trellis, down in the valley below, it is not a suitable area for grape production. And we will address that mesoclimate story in our next video. Thank you for your attention, and as always, happy grape growing.